Hello, this is John Hesse, Cahokia Presbyterian Church. I'd like to read from Wise Words by Peter Lythart. The story is The Magical Walnut. Once upon a time, a poor woodsman lived in the middle of a forest on the same piece of land where his father and his grandfather had lived. The woodsman worked very hard, but he remained poor because other people cheated him. He would spend half a day cutting down a tree and the other half dragging it through the forest to the sawmill. But the greedy owner of the sawmill gave him only a few coins for his labors. But the woodsman never complained or asked for more. Instead, he was happy and content. He had a roof over his head, which he had made himself. Even though he was poor, there was always just enough of everything to go around. Every morning at sunrise, he kissed his wife and children before he went off into the forest, singing in a glad voice. At dark, he would come home whistling. One day, as the woodsman was getting ready to cut down a tree, a voice called to him from the treetop. He looked up to see a squirrel hunched on a high branch. "Did you say something?" the woodsman asked. "I said, please do not cut down my tree," the squirrel answered. "I've lived here all my life. My grandfather lived in this tree when it was little more than a sapling. My children will live here when I die. Please do not take away our home." "I am sorry," the woodsman answered, "but I have a family too. I must feed and clothe them. I am a woodsman and I make my living by cutting down trees and selling them to the sawmill. If I do not cut down trees, I will not be able to take care of my family." "Sir, there are many other trees in the forest," the squirrel answered. "Yes, but this is one of the best, as you well know." The squirrel shook his tail for a moment. "Sir, I will make a deal with you." "What kind of a deal can you make?" the woodsman laughed. "If you promise not to cut down my tree, I can tell you an amazing secret. I promise you, this secret is worth more than any tree. Much, much more." The woodsman ran his hand over the bark of the tree. It was a solid tree. It might bring him good money at the sawmill, but it was not every day that a squirrel was willing to tell secrets. Perhaps the squirrel did have something very important to tell him. Besides, the woodsman liked the squirrel and felt sorry for him. Squirrels are often rude, he thought. Very few call anyone sir or please nowadays. This is the most polite squirrel I've ever met. With that, the woodsman made his decision. "Fine, I'll not cut down your tree. May your children's children live in it. Now, tell me your secret." "Do you see that young walnut tree there?" the squirrel asked, pointing his tail. "Go shake the trunk. You must shake it gently. See what happens." The woodsman shook the young walnut tree as gently as he could. He was expecting a shower of gold or diamonds, but instead, a single nut fell to his feet. He looked at the squirrel. "Is that all? A walnut? I can get plenty of walnuts from other trees." "Trust me," the squirrel said, "the walnuts from this tree are special." The woodsman was greatly disappointed. He had traded a tall, strong tree for a walnut. He was beginning to think that maybe that squirrel was only pretending to be polite. Perhaps all those rumors about squirrels being dishonest creatures were true after all. But a promise was a promise. He could not cut down the squirrel's tree. Without picking up the nut, he turned to go. "Sir, do not forget your walnut," the squirrel called after him. The woodsman picked up the nut, thrust it into his pocket, and walked off to find another tree to cut down. "There are plenty more," the squirrel called, "but take only one at a time. Only one." Then he disappeared into the top branches of the tree. By the time the woodsman arrived home that night, he had forgotten about the walnut. After dinner, he read a book to his children, prayed with them, and tucked them into bed. As he undressed, he felt a lump in his pocket and remembered the squirrel and the walnut. He took out the nut and examined it under a lamp. It was an ordinary-looking walnut, slightly green. Without another thought, he put it on the sill of his window, turned out the lamp, and rolled into bed. When all was quiet and the woodsman and his family were fast asleep, the walnut began to shake. Then it rolled in a circle, faster, faster. Finally, when it was spinning like a top, the shell popped open and a small fairy leaped out and looked around. With a flutter of her wings, for she was a girl fairy, the fairy darted into the kitchen and began to work as quietly as a kitten. All that night, the fairy worked in the house and the garden. She cleaned where the woodsman's wife had not had time to clean. When she touched the fruit on the table, the fruit doubled in size. When she flew through the garden, the beans and cabbages became larger and greener. As morning approached, she climbed back into the walnut, and the walnut and the fairy both vanished. When the woodsman and his wife awakened in the morning, they found the house clean, the fruit basket full, and the garden flourishing. They were overjoyed at their good fortune, and more than a little puzzled that the garden had grown so much overnight. They could not explain what had happened, but they gave special thanks over breakfast. The woodsman never noticed that the window was gone from the sill. Every morning for a week, the woodsman and his wife awoke to find the house clean. The vegetables in the garden continued to grow and grow. The woodsman's wife picked some of the best cabbages and sold them in the village square. The woodsman did not think about the walnut again until he passed the squirrel's tree some time later. Seeing him walk by, the squirrel called, "Sir, are things well?" Yes, very well," the woodsman said, thinking again how polite the squirrel was. "Didn't I tell you? You mean it was the walnut that brought us such a blessing?" The squirrel seemed to smile, and then he shook his tail and scampered away. Before he disappeared into the higher branches, he called back, "You need to get another one every week, just one." The woodsman was not sure that the squirrel was actually telling the truth, but what could it hurt? He went to the walnut tree and shook it gently. Another walnut dropped at his feet. When he got home that night, he put it on the windowsill. The next morning, everything was clean and shiny. The vegetables in the garden were even larger and better than they'd been the last time. When the woodsman looked at the windowsill, he noticed that the walnut was gone. And so it went, week after week. Every week, the woodsman went to the walnut tree, shook it gently, and took a single walnut to place on his windowsill. His wife sold the vegetables in town, and the woodsman was able to save some coin, which he carefully hid behind a loose brick on the hearth. One day, the sawmill owner's son was walking through the forest when he heard voices on the other side of a bush. Creeping closer, he saw the woodsman talking with the squirrel. "The walnuts are bringing blessings of every kind," the woodsman was saying. "Every one of the fairies has worked very hard. How can I ever thank you?" "Sir, you've already paid me back by being kind enough not to cut down my tree," the squirrel answered. The sawmill owner's son had noticed that the woodsman and his family looked fatter than ever before. He had eaten some of the cabbage and potatoes from the woodsman's garden, and he thought they were the very best he had ever tasted. Now he knew the secret of the woodsman's sudden prosperity. He watched as the woodsman shook the tree and picked up a walnut. Then he hurried back to tell his father. After hearing about the magical walnut tree, the greedy sawmill owner smiled slyly and scratched his chin. He was thinking about how rich he could be if he could get fairies to work for him. "I shall talk to the woodsman," he said to himself. "For the right price, he'll sell us the land where the magical walnut tree grows." That evening, the sawmill owner visited the woodsman. "You have struggled for many years to feed your family, haven't you, my friend?" He began with a smile that was just a little too big. When the woodsman nodded, he continued, "I want to make a deal with you. I want to buy your land. With the money I pay you, you will never have to worry again about caring for your family." "Oh no," said the woodsman. "This land belonged to my father and my grandfather. It will belong to my children after me. I could never sell this land. I have everything I could possibly want here. I am happy. Life is good for us." The sawmill owner argued with the woodsman for a long time. He offered more and even more money. Still, the woodsman refused to sell his land. Finally, the sawmill owner left in a whirlwind of anger. For days, the owner of the sawmill could think of nothing but that woodsman's small forest and its magical walnut tree. He wanted it so badly he could not eat or drink. When his wife discovered what was troubling him, she said, "Why don't you just take some walnuts? Go to the forest and bring home a big basketful and stop feeling sorry for yourself. You're an important man. Don't let that little woodsman stand in your way." So that very night, the sawmill owner and his son stole into the woodsman's forest to gather some walnuts. When they found the walnut tree in the darkness, they both grabbed hold and shook with all their might. Walnuts by the dozens rained to the ground. They shook and shook until no more walnuts fell. Then they gathered them into baskets and hurried home. The owner's wife was already in bed when they returned. They'd made so much noise, laughing and congratulating each other about their success, that she nearly threw a chair at them. When they carried the baskets inside, they excitedly spread the walnuts on the kitchen floor. Then they sat down to see what would happen. They waited, but nothing happened. Finally, they became bored and went to bed. As you can see, the sawmill owner and his son were both ignorant of the ways of fairies. The 28th edition of the Encyclopedia of Fairies, Volume 12, page 536, states clearly that fairies will not come out of walnut shells so long as there are people around. Acorns are an entirely different story, as everyone knows. As soon as people are in bed, though, fairies burst out of walnuts like popcorn. No sooner had the sawmill owner and his son fallen asleep than the walnuts began to shake and to spin and to open. Dozens of fairies flew out into the quiet house. Perhaps you've noticed something about children. While it is not terribly difficult to get one child to do housework, it is very hard to get several children to do housework at the same time. Children began washing dishes or making beds, and before long, they're splashing water on each other and having a pillow fight. Now, most authorities will tell you that fairies are a lot like children. One or two fairies are a lot of help around the house. When you get a few, and especially when you get dozens, they start to act silly and play instead of working. And fairies can play rough. That is why the sawmill owner, his wife, and his son were awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of clanging pots, splintering woods, and shattering glass. In horror, they rushed to the kitchen to find fairies flitting here and there, smashing chairs against the wall, playing sword fight with the kitchen utensils, and tossing the best dishes through the windows. Frantically, the sawmill owner ran through the kitchen, chasing fairies this way and that. Of course, he didn't catch them. When was the last time that you caught a fairy? When one of the fairies saw he was being chased, he sped into the dining room, while several others scooted a chair into the doorway. Before he knew what had happened, the sawmill owner tripped over the chair and was flying toward the dining room table. He landed with a tremendous crash. After he struggled to his feet, the fairies began to chase him. Now, normally, fairies are afraid of people, which is why you and I do not see them very often. But when you get a group of them together, and when they begin to have fun, they get bolder. These fairies were having so much fun, and they'd become so bold that one flew up to pull the sawmill's owner. Another tripped him as he stumbled backward. Another pulled at his nightshirt. To make matters even worse, some of the fairies escaped through the broken window and were making havoc of the sawmill. Throughout the night, one could hear crashing and banging as the sawmill was taken apart piece by piece. When morning came, the whole town gathered at the sawmill to survey the damage. Everything was destroyed. The sawmill owner told everyone that a pack of wild dogs had gotten loose in his house. No one really believed that story, so he said it was really a herd of cattle that had strayed from their farm. When no one believed that, he just stopped trying to explain what had happened. Later that day, the woodsman visited the sawmill owner. "I have a deal for you," he said. "I have saved some money from selling vegetables in town. I would like to buy your sawmill and house from you. I have saved enough to fix them so they will be as good as new." Since the sawmill owner had lost everything, and since his home insurance had no provision for damage done by fairies, he could do nothing but agree. So the woodsman bought the sawmill and repaired it. Before long, woodsmen were bringing trees from miles away because he always paid a fair price. He worked hard and lived prosperously and happily for the rest of his life. And though he never again needed a magical walnut, The woodsman always made sure that the polite squirrel's tree was never cut down. The moral is from Proverbs 13, verse 11. Dishonest money dwindles away, but he who gathers money little by little makes it grow. Thank you very much for listening.